I saw Elemental last night.
What's Elemental?
It's the new Pixar movie.
Oh, wait,
Yeah.
It looked really cute. Did you like it?
It was 10 out of 10 cute as It was so cute.
Aw.
Pixar, they don't miss. I was like, there hasn't been a single Pixar movie I haven't bawled at. This one's no exception.
I don't know when that like became part of the like fabric of Pixar movies that they like have to tear your soul out of your body and then put it back in. But
It was Up. It was. Did Up
oh
you
my
up
God.
bad when you first saw that?
You know, I've never seen it for the reason that everybody tells me that if I see it, I will be messed up because of my elderly complex where I can't with old people.
Will not survive the first 10 minutes.
I know.
Movie.
I can't.
You genuinely
I just know
will
that
be
I
taken
won't
out.
survive. I know.
I remember actually seeing that at my grandma's, and me, my dad, my sister watched it. My dad cried instantly.
Mm-hmm.
I had never seen him instantly bawl in the first 5 minutes of a movie. I was like, this is some shit. Like,
Yeah.
Whoa. Okay. Shall we do it? Shall we jump in?
Let's do it.
Now, okay. I know that we kind of like went back and forth last week, or I was going back and forth. Maybe this was just a solo thing where I was like, oh, what should we do? Because I was like, I wanted to come in with like a hard hitting episode. So I saw somebody suggested Kendrick Johnson, which I don't know if you know that story.
Mm-mm.
Have you heard of that? That's like
Mm-mm.
a mysterious death. I think we've talked about it a while ago, but it's a great case. We should cover it. It's very like, there's a lot of injustice, and it's like all fingers point to county, maybe covering something up. But I figured following the last case we did on Ellen Albert, we should do something lighter. So I was like, let me give the option over to Stu. And you picked the Flatwoods Monster.
Well, it's funny because it wasn't a solo thing, although I don't think I communicated it to you. But when you gave me those two options, I went like back and forth with it for like 5 minutes. But when you said that one of them was about a monster in Kentucky, that just, I was hooked.
It's in Kentucky. It's in Kentucky and West Virginia. It actually, most of this takes place in West Virginia. So we're rural.
Oh, I'm ready.
The last episode was intense. So this is, thank you to the Creepers, by the way. And welcome back, everybody, to CreepTime, the podcast with Silas Dean and Stu. And thank you guys for muscling through the story that we covered last week. But I was so grateful. I was grateful to you, Stu, as well, for listening to that, because it was a story that I'm like, I think everybody should hear her story.
Yeah.
It's miraculous.
Well, it's nice to hear always that they survive, but just to like think about yourself ever having to go through that and being like, okay, I kind of heard from someone else like the tools that they use to get through it, even if it's just like mental fortitude. Like, it was just nice to know that you're capable of surviving something like that.
Serious. I mean, it's very satisfying for me. I don't know if you feel that way when I listen to survival stories. I feel there's like a firm end to it. And for me, it's like satisfying in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we dive in, I have a few orders of business here. Of course, we love having you around, Creepers. So thank you so much for listening to another episode. Please do make sure, just because I've noticed, I was like, I don't know that everybody knows to follow or subscribe to the podcast, whether you listen on Apple, Spotify, or even YouTube. Please make sure you're following and subscribed so that you do not miss a beat with a new episode. And you can even turn on the bell notification, as Stu and I have talked about before.
Ding
well,
dong.
you're auto opted in because did you say ding dong?
Ding dong.
From now on, I'm not even going to push the bell notification. I'm going to say, and Creepers, ding dong.
Ding-a-ling. Yeah.
Ding dong.
They'll probably love that because they all accuse you of being sponsored by Spotify.
I know. I mean, I guess I am technically plugging it, but I promise you, they're not cutting me any money for promoting the bell notification. But I would love it if you hit the bell notification. We would both love that. And if you feel so inclined, please do leave us a review. That's me plugging that solo because I love reading the reviews, as we just read one before we got on. Thank you so much. And if you want to tell your friends or family, a coworker, if you want to contact your local Gilly Hicks and let them know about CreepTime, the podcast. Oh, and there was one thing I wanted to share this too before we started. I have a shout out that I wanted to give about a podcast called Heart Starts Pounding. So I don't know if you've listened to it, Stu, but Heart Starts Pounding is a podcast run by Kaylin, who I met at Parapod Festival. But we've kind of been on a similar track on TikTok for a while. We do very similar stories, similar content. So she also has a podcast, and it's so good. It's so good.
My
It's
mind
like horrors.
is blown right now. Because she pops up like sometimes on my suggestions.
Does she?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's so crazy. I've listened to a little bit of hers, and I think she's fabulous. So that's how interesting. That's awesome.
Yeah, her podcast is like true like horror storytelling, and she really like leans into it well. I feel like we kind of dance around like, I don't know, like the levity of it, like the comedic element, but she goes straight for the jugular. She's like, you want to be scared? I'm going to make you scared.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, so I just wanted to shout out her podcast because I know that she wanted to shout out CreepTime on her podcast as well. So her podcast, Heart Starts Pounding, is a podcast of horrors, hauntings, and mysteries for the darkly curious. Ding, ding, ding. So each week, Kaylin takes you through stories ranging from deaths at Disney parks, all the way to ghost stories and many more. And episodes air every Thursday. So if you want to catch her pod on a Thursday and then roll around over here on a Friday, we'll be waiting for you.
Hearts start pounding, and then thongs start snapping.
Thongs start snapping. Welcome back, everybody, to Thongs Start Snapping, hosted by Silasine and Stu.
Oh my gosh, the Gilly Hicks of it all has given us such a chuckle. Oh,
she's fantastic though. Doing the panel with her was really cool because she has such a great mind for these stories and like really finding the ones that are going to like give you chills. So I would highly recommend her podcast. And with that, I am going to shift us over into what this case is about for today. Now, let's get into a little top line for you, Stu, because I feel like this is going to really be one that you're going to latch onto. Solely because when I think about like monsters, I wasn't thinking about it in the context of this story. This is really a story about aliens, I think. And it takes place in the 1950s, which I think is like peak time for like alien fantasticalism. That's not a word, but you know what I mean? Like when I think of aliens, I think of like 1950s retro futurism, Area 51.
Yeah.
So the story of the Flatwoods monster takes us back to the 1950s in West Virginia, where this event took place with a group of children and teenagers who claimed to see something of what you could describe as a monster from outer space, for a lack of a better description. Now, this was assumed to be the work of children's imaginations because it was a small town, until adults saw it too. The events that took place in this town have long been the subject of debate, as they seem, far from anything that we could imagine to be true. But shockingly, there's a high number of witnesses who verified these sightings, as well as verifiable documentation that is public facing from the US government that something went down in this town in the 1950s. Something of the magnitude that the US government would not only be aware of it, but they would take an interest in investigating it. So let's get into the mystery of the Flatwoods monster. Or do you not buy it? Should we just scrap the whole episode?
No, I had no idea that the US government got involved. And anytime I love stories of like files that are like classified or like things that I think that's so fascinating, especially given the time period. I'm excited.
Well, once I get into like some of the officials, let's say, who came to visit this town, it's really interesting. I mean, I don't know if we've ever gone into like theories or conspiracies about Men in Black, but it is very much that. Something happened here. We don't know what, but something. So let's dive in. What exactly happened in Flatwoods? Because Flatwoods is the name of the town in West Virginia. So I'm going to paint the picture. It is 7 p.m. on the evening of September 12th, 1952. We're in the small town of Flatwoods, West Virginia, and there's a group of these young boys who are outside. It's like dusk, and they're playing football, when all of a sudden they all kind of stopped because there is this huge light that's flying in the sky right above them before it kind of like barrels to the distance, like near the hill, and just, it looked like it crashed. Now, from their description, they thought it was a meteor. They're like, it's a round glowing ball of light, and there's like smoke trailing behind it. So it's got to be like something from space that crashed. But also something didn't really feel right because it's not exactly how they imagined fully what a meteor crash might look like. It was kind of low to the ground. Like it came out of nowhere, but it was low enough where they're like, that didn't look like it came from space, if you know what I mean. Like it didn't look like it came straight down to the earth. So the boys, they start getting really excited. Like they wanted to go check it out. And they're like teasing each other like, oh my God, what if it was a UFO or something? Like they're not concerned at all. They just think it's cool that they saw the thing. But in the midst of them joking, they look over to the hill, like right where it crashed. And they all kind of go silent for a second because suddenly whatever it was, it like lifts itself up, like it moves. And then it shifts over the hill, like goes out of sight, kind of disappears. Now, they can still see the glow of its light like over the hill, but they're still not thinking like that was something sinister or like eerie. They're like, oh, we've got to go check that out, whatever the hell it was. Like, how often could you see a meteor from space? Like, that's a very rare event. I would be excited too. So they're curious, and they're all planning to go rush to the hill. 12-year-old Freddie May, who kind of sounds like he's leading the pack, like he just sounds like the loudest boy in the group, he kind of breaks everyone up from like joking and speculating because they're all like, oh my God, it's got to be like Martians or something like that. And he's like, you guys are idiots. It's clearly like a meteor. I know what I'm talking about. And he goes, we should go there and we should collect parts of it to bring into class because that's the logical thing that you should do when something is burning and like comes from space. You should go and touch it. So they all agree though. They're like, all right, yeah, let's like plan to go up to the hill. It's getting dark. So if it's getting dark, we have to go back and we have to like tell a parent that like we're not going to be home after dark. Like we're going to go to the hill and find this thing. So they go running back through the yard and they go back to, I think it's Freddie's mom's house. Her name is Kathleen. Now this mother, she's a local beautician, such as myself, and she is just like getting home. Like she just got home from work and she wanted to head upstairs and like take a shower, like take her pants off, and all of these kids come running in and they're like, Mom, there's a meteor that crashed, can we like go outside and check it? She doesn't buy it. She's like, there's no meteor, I don't know what you're talking about. And they're like, no, come to the porch. She steps outside. The first thing she sees in the distance is that red glowing light over the hill, and she's like, oh, okay. She's like, maybe there is something. I don't know what it is. She's like, but if you're going to go, I'm going to go with you. But she doesn't want to go without like an older guy there too. So she actually calls a local 17-year-old who one of the neighborhood kids, but quite interesting, I would say. Kathleen, local beautician. So she calls this 17-year-old. His name is Gene Lemon, and he happens to be in the National Guard. So he comes along to like kind of guide the group, and someone's dog also comes. Because why not? Bring a dog. Yeah. So they all set out on foot. They're going towards the hill in the dark now, just to see like what fell from the sky. They make their way to the dirt trail that's going to take them over the hill. And they're kind of like peeling through the brush, but they can still see the glow. Like they know where they're going. As they're getting closer, they can tell that the lights are kind of like humming is the best way I can describe it. Like they're dimming on and off, but not quite a flash. Like they're pulsating. If that makes sense?
Yes.
And then it feels like, okay, whatever fell, it doesn't seem like a rock or a meteor. It seems like a machine, kind of. Now the air is becoming noticeably warmer, like really, really warm. And everything starts kind of getting misty, like a fog is like rolling in the closer that they're getting over this hill. And it becomes like really thick, dense air, humid. And then as they get close, this disgusting smell like pierces through all of them. It is the way they described it. They're like, it's a mix of burning metals and maybe sulfur, something metallic, like metal burning is what they said. And everyone starts getting really uncomfortable. Like the boys are like kind of tugging at like their throats and their collars. Like it's getting hard to breathe the air, and everybody's eyes are burning and they're watering, but they kind of push forward. They're like, okay, we come this far. We got to see what the damn thing is. Now they get over the top of the hill, and they've got a clear shot of what they're looking at through the fog. And it just looks like a glowing bright mass in the middle of this farmland. Like they still can't really tell like what it is they're looking at because it's so foggy, but they know for sure, all of them, they're like, that's not a meteor. But it's also not an aircraft. It's not like an airplane that's on fire. So it's just, it's something they can't recognize. From witness statements, this is what gets crazy. Half the boys said that it was like a humming noise that was coming from it, like the machine was hissing. And then all of the recollections of like the size are like all over the place. Some people are like, it might have been like 25 feet long. And then some of the boys said that it was like as big as a house, like a small house. And the boys and this mother, they're just staring at the fireball and they're trying to figure out like what it is they're looking at, and they do not see what's coming next. Suddenly, Gene, the 17-year-old, screams, the one from the National Guard. He starts screaming and he looks to the right, and right near them, just 15 feet away, stood beside an oak tree, hovering in the air, is this massive, towering, dark figure that is looking right at them. It's described as something that was twice the size of a human, with a thin build, and the top of its head almost came to like a point. They said it was like it was wearing a hood. Now, the face, from what they could make out, had two round, like portholes, basically, where the eyes should be, and it had kind of a red nose, and the face itself was almost completely round. There's no mouth. There's nothing they can see that looks like a mouth. And there's a slight tint to like the portholes where the eyes should be. Very specific. And everyone like really like was sunk on the description of this thing, which I think is really interesting. Like nobody kind of falters from that. Mm-hmm. Everyone goes into shock and starts screaming. Gene hits the flashlight so he can like shine it on the thing. And that's when they realize the creature is translucent. You can see through it. And the other boys claimed that on the inside of it is like a small beam of light at its core, and it had claws for hands. Let's pause there and just discuss. Any thoughts on what that could have been, other than an alien? I did think when I heard translucent, I was like, skinny. So thin.
So thin. Yeah, because something translucent would indicate to me that it's like light, like fur, maybe, if it was going to be like an animal or something. Like they would think that it's, but I'm not getting the vibe of like animal. If it's something else, I'm getting the vibe of, I mean, honestly, the first thing this made me think of was, have you seen Arrival?
No, I've never seen it. I've always wanted to.
It's very similar, like kind of story where they come down and the figures are like, they're way bigger than humans, but they're like kind of this weird, they're like objects almost. Like they don't look human. They look like these kind of shapes, but there's something about them that is, they can communicate. So that was my first thought as you were describing it. I was like, wow, that sounds a lot like the creatures in Arrival.
I wonder if they took inspiration out of this when they were.
I bet they did.
Drumming up like the look of like what those aliens might look like, because it's funny you're saying they look like machines, because the next part of this is Kathleen's description, and she's saying the claws were metallic and they almost looked like antennas, but were like TV antennas that were curved, which is so specific. I could never like imagine that just without a reference point, you know?
Right. Well, there's so much.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Well, there's so much. I think back then they didn't have as much like futurism kind of storytelling yet. So this is very specific for back then, where I feel like coming up with this idea of like what an alien is was pretty new.
I would agree for sure. I mean, especially in a place like West Virginia, I can't imagine. I mean, clearly, like they had some sort of pop cultural reference of like little green men from Mars kind of thing.
Yeah.
But this feels so specific that it's difficult for me to imagine that this was something that they just drummed up, you know, to tell a story. And there's so many of them, so many of these kids. And there is one descriptive piece that they all like are so firm on. It has no legs. There's nothing below the torso. It's just floating. So it looks like. Then as they're looking at this thing and they're in shock, without warning, it starts to squirt out oil all over them. That is also extremely specific. Gene, the National Guard kid, almost blacks out from terror. He falls to the ground, dropping the flashlight. And that dog, out. Dog bolts out of getting the hell out of Dodge. And we know the dog always knows.
Right.
I mean, well, it just like sends them into pandemonium because they all start scattering. They're just sprinting back to the house because half of them are covered in this oil, this like substance. And they're running so fast, actually, that when they get to the fence, they don't even use the gate. They hop they're crawling over the fence. Even Kathleen. Just reaction to like that experience. I mean, the oil is so much.
The oil is it's so weird. So just to recap, there's basically this one huge machine, right? That's the main event that they thought was like the meteor. That's pulsating
the ship,
this
I guess
light.
you could say.
Okay, the ship. And then the figure that's just kind of like hovering around them. It's just one.
Yeah. So if it's just one that they saw. So they were looking at what we thought was the ship or the meteor, I guess, this like pulsating light, which is why they didn't look to their right, which is where the oak tree was, which is where the creature was kind of like hiding next to in the dark. So this, like the glowing light thing had their attention. It wasn't until the creature was close enough that they could like sense something was near them that they saw all of this. And then the oil was all over them. So they just like sprint. They're panicking. But the chaos does not end there. Like, this is just the beginning of like how crazy this night gets, because they run back to Kathleen's house. She gets everybody inside. She's like, get inside the living room. The dog has already like gone to a corner of the house and is hiding because all hell is breaking loose with this oil. Like, they're struggling to breathe because the oil reeks of that smell, that like burning metallic smell that they like smelled on the hill. And there are kids that are like gagging on the floor and like sobbing and like they just can't get air in their lungs. Jean is in the bathroom, projectile vomiting, and everyone is just scrambling to like sinks and like showers and like trying to like wash the oil off their skin because they cannot get air in. Kathleen, trying to hold down the fort, she's completely bewildered because don't forget, she didn't even think it was a meteor, let alone whatever the hell she saw out there. So she's like, I don't know what to do. I have to call for help. She calls for the sheriff. Our first introduction of county in this story.
I was going to say, we haven't had a minute. In a minute, we haven't said county.
We haven't said, well, she calls county, and lo and behold, county actually does not come. So this is also a defamation story against county. From the records, the call came in. So this call did happen at 8:15 p.m., where she is frantically explaining what she just saw and that she needs officers there now. And she's also asking, like, you need to send an ambulance. Like, these kids cannot breathe and they're turning blue. And this is where it gets interesting. So the operator says that the sheriff cannot come because he's not even in the town. He was called over to Frametown to investigate another report of a crash from the sky where a plane went missing. Is that not? That's so interesting. To me, when I was like, okay, that's two separate points that are like documented in the records where something happened, you know, like a crash happened. So he's not even in the town, and it's the 1950s, so nobody has like a phone to call the guy. So she's like, well, you have to send somebody. So let's see. Timestamp wise, the Braxton County Sheriff, he got the call right after 7 p.m. to go to the other town, Frametown, to investigate the crash report, which timeline wise, that tracks with when the boys who were playing in this town, Flatwoods, saw their crash. So I was like, that's pretty convincing. Like, I would find that hard to refute, like records wise, at least. So his call, the sheriff, he's like, here's what we can do. Or the operator is like, what we can do, because the sheriff is over there, we can send somebody else, but I'm going to have to make a few calls. The sheriff who got called out to the other town for that crash, I think his name is Robert Carr. He had an incoming call come from a hitchhiker, no less, who was getting a ride, and then they saw the crash, like what they thought was a burning plane in the sky. They couldn't define what it was, so they got to a phone, and they're like, you've got to send somebody out. So the officer who got there to that location, he ends up not finding any trace of what was explained. Oops, I just whacked my hand. Sorry.
That's what happens when we start talking about county. It's about to get heated.
I'm sorry, everybody. I don't sever my own finger. Well, he went to that crash site in the other town, and he was like looking for this like plane, this mysterious plane that went down. Couldn't find it. There's no trace of like any remnants of a crash. So he was like, oh, I wasted my time. Meanwhile, the operator had already started making phone calls to be like, can we get anybody out to like the Flatwoods house to see what's going on with Kathleen and these kids? They end up calling this guy named Ailey Stewart. He is a photojournalist. They send a journalist But because he's a former Air Force veteran, so surprisingly, this was not as uncommon as I imagined. If cops are like a sheriff was like out of town or like couldn't come to a call, they would usually send like a veteran, or they would send somebody who was like kind of worked with the police in that way, or like was used to seeing like a scene like this. Seems
Right.
safe. So 30 minutes after that call, he gets to Kathleen May's house, and it's just as chaotic as when the call came in. Like he literally walks in, and as he opens the door, there are 3 boys in front of him who just throw up on the floor. Like the entire house is like screaming still and struggling to breathe. And he gets to Kathleen, and when he gets to her, she's completely coated in this oil. Like she stinks. And he described like trying to talk to people in the house, and he found it very difficult. Like they were so petrified. Most of them were having trouble speaking, which I also think is really interesting from an acting perspective, if this is all for show.
Yeah.
I was like, damn, you really sold, didn't you?
Well, you just gave me a sigh of relief here, because one of my questions was going to be, was there any proof, and like did somebody else see them covered in this oil? Like I was a little nervous that you were going to say nobody ever like saw it on them.
No, they saw the oil. I think she kept the clothes because it was her work uniform. So she kept it, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. Like, am I going to try to wash this out? Should I just throw these away?
That's so weird.
I think the clothes were eventually confiscated from the officials that came to visit her, which is also interesting. So he was trying to talk to everybody, and he's like, what happened? He eventually tries to get like them to calm down enough where he's like, would you like take me to the site? So I think he gets Gene and one of the older boys, Neil, the 2 eldest actually, I guess they are, to bring him over to the crash site. So they walk over and they bring a shotgun, as you do. Sounds like a story I'm into.
Always.
And they cross the line over the hill, and once they get there, to everyone's shock, there's nothing there. The light is gone, and there's no trace of the crash, like of a meteor crash, we could say, like a crater. It's just like the grass is totally flattened, kind of like a crop circle, you know?
Weird.
But there is oil all over the ground, and it has that very distinct smell, that burning, horrific, metallic smell. And he, from his witness statement, he was like, the scent was like sickening. He's like, and I've been in combat. He was like, I thought it was something maybe I could liken to like a mustard gas. He's like, but it wasn't. He's like, it's something that I've never smelled before. He's like, but it was so hard to breathe. So he sees all this, and he's like, I mean, the story could be somewhat credible. And don't forget, he's a journalist. So he's like, I'm going to come back in the morning and like check it out for myself in daylight. So he comes back in the morning, looks at it in broad daylight. And what he finds near the oak tree where they claim to see the creature, there are these drag marks that are 8 feet apart from each other that go from the oak tree right down to where the grass was flattened, where the ship would have been. And again, the ground is still covered in the oil. So he's like, something went down that night. Do you have any thoughts on that? Does it feel credible so far?
It feels credible. I already sort of have one little theory that's bubbling, but
okay.
But I'm gonna save it.
Okay, save it. Now, that same morning, it's the very next morning after he's coming back, this photojournalist, Kathleen, she's back at the home because everything has calmed down, and she gets a knock at her door from these 2 strange men. They inform her that they are photojournalists from the nearby town of Clarksburg. A likely story. And they make claims that they had heard tell of like the monster that she saw, and they were hoping that she could show them out to like the area where everything happened. She is feeling off about this because these guys are impeccably dressed, like very sharp suits. And she's like, you guys are journalists from Clarksburg? But she's like, okay. She's like, I'll show you out anyway. So they go out, and she kind of notes their behavior as very odd once they get out there, almost like they're too comfortable with what they're seeing, like they're familiar with what they're seeing. Because they take note of the drag marks, they're like looking around, they're asking questions, and then they really fixate on the oil. They're like obsessed with the oil, and they start to touch it a lot. They're like playing with it in their hands, and they're like looking at it, and they're like not concerned about their clothes because they're wiping it all over like they're covered in oil. And she's like, what the hell is going on with these guys? And then at some point she's like listening to them, and she kind of overhears one of them whispering, saying like, what do you think they're going to think about this? Like talking about like a headquarters or something maybe. So she's just off put by the guys, but eventually they're just like, thank you so much for showing us out. And they take off in these suits, these like oil drenched suits, which is weird as hell. The very next day, they come back to her door and they confess. They go, we're not journalists. We're actually DC officials, and we have to ask you some questions. And she was like, well, wait a sec. Why did you tell me you were photojournalists? Why didn't you just tell me who you were? And they're like, well, we were concerned that if we told you that we were officials, you probably wouldn't take us out to the crash site, or you probably wouldn't like be so forthcoming about like what you saw. So she has no problem. She invites them in. And I think that they just like question her really intensely. It's just a very like serious back and forth specifically about that oil. They were like, they want to know everything about it. Like, what color was it when it came out? They're like, what did you feel when it was on you? Like, was it warm? Like, did it always have the smell? Do you have the clothing from last night? And they take that clothing. She's like, yeah, I've got it's my uniform. And they're like, thank you. She provides a full description of the creature. And again, they leave. And then a month later, she receives something in the mail. I'm going to get into that in a second. But what do you think about those men that just showed up there? Any thoughts on what I think are the men in black?
Well, yeah, when you said they kind of told her why they didn't tell her, I was like, and that's federal versus county, y'all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on federal.
That's on federal.
I can't, can you imagine? That would have been so back in the 50s, like in a very rural town. So
scary.
jarring.
I would tell them anything they wanted.
Yeah, exactly. And also like that kind of stuff just doesn't happen out there. I'm sure they were, I don't know. I'm sure in some way it was kind of amazing for her. Like what a shake up to her day-to-day routine. Like
totally. Yeah. It's like y'all
sounds
are here
like a
from
movie.
DC? Yeah. It totally is. Yeah. To me, it feels like the architecture of like a lot of like scenarios we've seen in alien movies of like rural America, an unsuspecting home, maybe like an unsuspecting housewife, and then suddenly these like very sharp men show up and they're like, tell us about what you saw. I was like, this is like the inception of that narrative.
Yes. Because you can't do alien movies in big cities. Nobody's curious enough.
I know. Yeah. The aliens don't care to come to New York. They're not coming to like Simi Valley. They're not. What alien goes to like Portland? Like we're not
honest
into it.
To God, that would be an incredible satire. Aliens visiting like metropolitan America, and
I just like don't know what business they have there. Yeah, although there was that story from a few weeks back. I don't know if you saw that, of the thing that happened in Vegas. Did you hear about that?
No.
Vegas is like a desert, but
yeah.
You didn't hear that story?
No.
So there was a call, like a frantic call that came into 911 from this family, and they were like, something just crashed in our backyard, and there are like people out there in our backyard, and they're like, who are the people? Can you give us a description? And they're like, ma'am, they don't even look like people. They're like huge. They're these giant people in our backyard. And they're like, well, what else do they look like? They're like, they just have really big eyes, and they're like 9-10 feet tall. They're huge people. And she's like, okay, family's probably on drugs. Let's send a cruiser out there. But there is evidence that crash happened, because on a body cam across the neighborhood that night, on a county officer's body cam, there is a huge, giant, green glowing thing that went soaring through the sky and crashed, which time matched to their Ring camera. Because you can see on the porch on their Ring camera, you hear this huge like, and then like a crash, and there's a giant green glow. Like something crashed in their backyard. So they were panicking, and they were like, please somebody, like send an officer. Like, we don't know what to do. We're trying to film it, but we're scared. And they said they're hiding. The things, like the people in the backyard, were hiding like in their backyard, like behind bushes and stuff. By the time the officers got there, no evidence of the crash. Nothing. A little weird.
That's so wild. Wow. How long ago was that?
This was like a week or two ago. I realized I did something as I told that story. I'm like, this is probably how like every alien story is told, where they like drop all these bombs and they're like, little strange. I don't. You be the judge.
That's so true. That's so true. Our
They're like, but what do I know?
I know our ability to suspend disbelief about aliens is amazing to me.
I mean, the more specific a story gets, the more likely I am to believe it. Like, this is why this story is compelling to me, is because the oil squirting out is, I suppose you could say, the work of science fiction, but not something I would peg to come from like a random family that lives in Flatwoods, West Virginia.
Absolutely. It's funny because I was thinking too that I feel like I'm normally kind of skeptical, and I actually happen to think that there's probably, I mean, I definitely think there's other life outside of Earth, but I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if tomorrow something landed on Earth. Like, I fully believe that there's a possibility of aliens.
I do too. Well, it's funny because while I was doing research, I wanted to tell you this, like, I guess it's an analogy, but it was, I forgot who it was with, but she was a scientist who kind of studies this, but she also studies like the cosmos, like at large. And she was talking about, she was posed the question, like, do you believe there is life in the universe? And she's like, I will put it this way so you can have a visualizer. She's like, imagine like the known universe is comparable size-wise to like the ocean, right? All of the water on planet Earth. That is the size of the universe. She was like, in the context of what we have explored, that is the equivalent of going to the ocean, like straight to the Pacific, taking a 12-ounce glass and scooping up water. That's how much we've explored of the universe. She's like, so when people ask me, do you think there's life out there? She's like, well, if you put it in the, this analogy of the ocean, if you go to the ocean, scoop with a 12-ounce glass, and you look at the glass and you're like, no fish in that glass. I bet there's no fish in this entire ocean. That she's like, that's what I hear when people are like, brilliant. There are no aliens out there. And I'm like, wow, that's really clear that it would be shocking to me if there wasn't anything out there. But maybe they're not as like grand as like we've pictured them, as like giant green men from Mars kind of thing. Like, maybe they're like bugs. Maybe they're really tiny. Maybe they're cute.
I'm sure there's multiple versions. Yeah.
Maybe they're not even like a fully solidly formed being. It could be like a gas, a living gas.
I think that's a Pokemon.
I'm just referencing seeing Elemental last night. That's all.
I was going to say, wait, didn't you see Elemental last night?
I'm pitching it like it's an original idea to him. Like, what if they're actually a gas? Think about that.
That's amazing.
So let me get into what happens with Kathleen, because a month passes and she gets a letter from the Pentagon. One should be so lucky, which includes a professional sketch and mock-up of the monster that she described. And it also includes an explanation letter. Now, the mock-up actually doesn't look like a creature. It looks like her description of a creature that was then turned into like the shape of like a rocket. Kind of like, it's like loosely shaped as to how she describes. So the explanation letter is like, here's what you saw on this evening, ma'am. So they were like, the government launched 4 experimental rockets, and one of them went missing and likely crashed in that area. And they were like, it was having oil trouble. So it's like hitting all of the keywords of her story. And they're like, and it was carrying 2 men inside. But it goes into no explanation as to like what she really saw. It's like not talking about like, did the men survive? Like, this is what you experienced. This is how we explain the oil. They're like, you probably just saw the ship and it was probably disorienting. So that's what you saw. Nothing else. And they also ask her, they're like, and we would appreciate it if you kept your discretion on the event, like keep it a secret, which she does. She keeps it a secret for like decades, because here's the thing, and why I agree with Kathleen. If the Pentagon is contacting me and they're like, you probably saw an alien, but keep that hush hush, I'm doing it. Like,
yeah.
Like, what do I have to gain from going out there and being like, listen, everybody? Like,
right.
Like, well, I'm trying to be safe.
I mean, my theory when I said that one was bubbling was that it was like a government testing weapons, and maybe it was, which now that you're saying that they were saying that it was a rocket, Which, okay.
They said it was with men inside of it. They were like, which they never explained. Like, did the men live or did they die? Like, what was
Yeah,
where did the thing even go? Like, it's just such clear BS. But they were like, she's like a common woman from West Virginia. She won't think twice.
oh my gosh. Does she still does she still have the letter?
I think so. I mean, we've never seen proof of this letter
Yeah,
because, like I said, for decades after the fact, she's like, I'm going to keep every ounce of this a secret. Like, she keeps the letter and
sure.
she keeps these visits from the men. She doesn't tell anybody about the visits from the men, which makes it feel even more credible to me for someone to like hold on to this for like decades. And then eventually, as she gets like older, because I think she eventually passed, obviously, but she was like, it's like end of the life confessions where she's like, by the way, the men in black did come. They told me to keep my mouth shut. I don't know. It's interesting, though, that she chose to keep that private. It's a story that she for sure could have capitalized on back in the day. And I could imagine that maybe she would need the money for her family at a certain point, but she did not.
Yeah.
She kept that very quiet.
Yeah. I mean, also just for like pure gossip's sake and giving you something to do in a small town. I mean, that would have been the story for her to tell people, and she didn't, which I think, like you said, adds to her credibility for sure.
I agree. Well, it's funny because if you remember, she keeps it quiet, but that's all for naught because they didn't send a sheriff to the scene first. They sent a journalist. A
Oh,
wise
right.
decision.
I
So
forgot.
once he came back in the daytime and he was like, there is some evidence that this happened. He goes to town. The whole town actually like goes into chaos because he prints the story and then gossip and rumors spread like wildfire and suddenly the whole town is consumed with reporters and scientists and mediums. We were there. We showed up.
The original Parapod.
Yes, but they all come flooding in because they're like, oh my god, something happened here. And there is actually an investigation that I think it goes on where they interview a number of people in this town and they find out that there is some consistency in this like 7 p.m. crash part of the story because they were not the only people outside of like this family and like the hitchhiker who said we saw a crash that night at 7 p.m. or something like falling out of the night sky. So that adds more weight to the story for me where I'm like, yeah, something happened here.
Right.
And there is this constant description too about what they saw in the sky, the bright orange ball of fire. That does not deviate from person to person. Yeah.
I think the other thing too, like you said at the very beginning, is when there's children and adults and they both saw the same thing, that's like kind of foolproof.
But also all the witness statements of like the children who were literally gagging, throwing up, like sweating, crying on the floor. I mean, unless they're just selling like Streep, I don't really know how to explain that episode. Sorry.
Agreed.
But I was going to say, this story actually doesn't sit only in Flatwoods from that night because we've mostly talked about these sightings in this town. It goes beyond the town on the same night at the same time. So on the same night, same time, 7 p.m., there are sightings all over the U.S. of something crashing from the sky. And there were reports that were unrelated that came in from Pennsylvania, D.C., Maryland, and California on that night, 7 p.m. in the time, like East Coast time.
Whoa.
Spooky, spooky. So it's kind of like a mass event that took place.
Yeah.
For the records that I was able to dig up, let's see. On this night, when the crash happened in West Virginia alone, there were 5 total separate sightings and reports of things that crashed from the sky, which led to this theory. So this was the theory that people were drumming up. Like directionally, it's likely that whatever these things were, they came from the Atlantic, crossed over Maryland, and then something went wrong. Like they veered off course and came to West Virginia where they kind of burned up and crashed there. And there are some skeptics who were like, well, we don't buy this story. Like, we don't do or believe in UFOs, and we certainly don't believe in this monster. So they're like, okay, let's come up with a logical explanation for what went down in Flatwoods. And they think what everybody saw was probably a meteor. They're like, it's a meteor that crashed from space, which then caused this massive fog, and there were like lots of gases. And maybe from the light of the meteor and like the gases, it could have created some strange shadows, which maybe like spooked the boys and Kathleen, and then they went into hysterics because they thought they saw a monster. And I think that this explanation is like shockingly stupid, because if it was a meteor,
Yeah.
well, because if it was a meteor, it's like, are we just going to completely ignore that there's one, no crater, but two, no meteor? Like, there's no meteor that's ever found.
Exactly. And it's not like burning ground. It was just flat grass.
I'm like, y'all, like, I know we want to find a logical end to some of this, but it's got to be foolproof. Like, it can't be. Yeah, it was probably just something like a rock from the sky.
Also,
and all that oil. What about that oil?
Yeah, I was going to say the oil for sure is so odd and would make you think it's coming from a vehicle of some kind, like a vehicle, meaning
some kind
like,
of a machine. Yeah.
Something that had to like be launched in some way.
I even
there needed fuel.
I was thinking, I was like, what? Okay, so what if it was kind of like what you were theorizing on? It could have been like a weapon of like destruction, or like a terrorist weapon, but maybe it was flying in, coming from another country. If the theory is that directionally it was coming from the Atlantic and then veered off course, but the description of it is so bizarre that I'm like, if that was a machine, because it kind of is described as like half being, half like machine. How, I can't imagine like how that was even created. It's translucent, has glowing eyes, a round face, and it's squirting oil.
That's the part of all of this that just doesn't make sense, that you're trying to come up with a theory, like a rationale for it, is the actual figure. Like, what was that thing? The machine makes total sense to me. I could see that being a weapon or a rocket or whatever, but what is that? And it did something to them. Like, it was squirting them with something. Like, there's a intent there.
Probably, I would say the most damning part of the story that I think kind of cracks all of like the scientific and logical explanations of this is that there is front-facing proof that the U.S. government was involved in this, and that those visitations to Kathleen did happen. In the public-facing Airfare Project Blue Book files, there is a clear record that something happened in this town, and they investigated it. And that is the extent of the public-facing explanation of what went down. Does that add some credibility to this? Or is that like, well, that could happen in either scenario, whether it's terrorists or whether it's a U.S. experiment or whether it is UFOs?
Well, I think anytime U.S. officials come into the mix, it's to protect themselves in some way. So,
Agreed.
I don't think it's so much. I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of feeling like it's not. And I really like the theory that it could have been from another country or external, like weaponry that was used, or rocket or whatever. But I'm still feeling like it was an internal thing, like within the U.S., and it was just like screwed up.
Oh,
if it's a real,
interesting,
like they just messed up. So what?
I can get behind
why
that theory.
They would show up to her house and be like, "This is what you saw." Don't well, I mean, blow this for us.
That could be true in the event that it's UFOs anyway. You know, like if it is an alien experience, it would be. Or is that what you were saying? I thought you meant like U.S. experiment that went wrong.
I meant U.S. experiment that went wrong.
Gotcha. That is a pretty sophisticated piece of tech. If like all of those things that they saw were true, and then like it disappears by that night, that's a pretty bizarre piece of technology that leaves no trace.
Well, my thought behind that was that what if they were aware that they were going to be conducting this experiment, and they had officials nearby to collect, shrapnel or whatever that happened to show up. But I mean, that's a pretty quick cleanup job. But
it's possible. I mean, it also just kind of ignores like some of what I would assume would happen to the elements. Something, I mean, we've seen when like aircrafts go down in the US, they burn up, they crash, and there's fire or there's impact or there's burned grass. Like, that's what's odd to me, is that I can fully believe this was a US experiment, this was a US aircraft of some sort, even if it wasn't recognizable, and that even what they saw, the creature, was some kind of a US experiment, like a tech. I can believe all that, but for them to go back to that scene, find all of it gone, in addition to no crater and no burned gas, even though they smelt like burning metal and it was a ball of fire, so they described it. It's strange to me.
Yeah. It would
If
have
you
had to have
remember,
been.
I'm just thinking of this now. I want
Yeah.
to hear what you think about it. Remember when we did the Bermuda Triangle episode? Remember what they saw out in the Bermuda Triangle?
Mm-hmm.
It was an orange ball of fire. Just saying.
Stop. Oh my God. This was actually a sunset in this version. They saw the sun setting.
I did say it was dusk, did I not?
Yeah.
I was like, the boys were out playing during dusk. Well, okay, so it's funny because Flatwoods, eventually, they capitalize on the sensationalism of this because the reporters don't stop coming. And the story, like years down the line, they're like, oh, well, let's like actually personify the monster of Flatwoods, like the Flatwoods monster. And it becomes a huge tourist attraction, brings in a lot of money to the account, or not the account, the economy. Someone's account. But they hold a festival every year. I think it's called like the Little Green Men Festival, I think. We should totally go. It's right in West Virginia every year. And it's in August, I think.
Oh my gosh, we actually should go. That'd be so much fun.
Really I would absolutely do it. And they also have a museum there. Like they've really like created a story in this town following this. It's probably the only thing that would take me out to West Virginia.
Country roads, baby.
Country roads. Now, so we know that part of it, but I did want to get into one other thing that happened in Kentucky. That's what I was talking about with Kentucky before.
Yeah.
So there is an additional event that happens in Kentucky, I think not even like 2 years later, and it's very similar. And this part of Kentucky to Flatwoods is only about 400 miles away. So I'm going to dive into that. So in this instance of this event that happened in Kentucky, it is not just a single monster that is witnessed. It is an entire group of these things. So I'm going to take you a couple years later. It's August 21st. They also have a festival in this town, too, to celebrate this event, which is really messed up when you hear the story. 1955 it is. And we get a witness testimony from the Sutton family. I'm not going to take us on a housewives thing.
I was going to say, don't
that's
even.
That's all I could. Don't even. Well, her last name is Strack, but anytime
Sutton.
I hear Sutton,
I know.
it just
it's such a
me.
Southern name. I love it.
So this was a normal evening for this family, and they came to the dinner table around supper time. Now, oddly enough, the event also took place 2 or 3 years later at 7 p.m., which is weird. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about that, but I just saw that like line up in the research. So one of the house guests who's over, he's there for dinner, and his name is Billy Ray Taylor. He offers to go run out to fetch some water from the well for their dinner. And almost the second he gets outside onto the porch, he sees something that mirrors the exact experience in Flatwoods. It is a large, glowing, round object that is burning up in the sky until it crashes in the distance. Now, to his description, it looks like it's crashing, but then suddenly it like slows itself before it gets to the ground, and it seems to like land in the distance in like a gully, and then it really like kind of like inches its way over the hill, like it's moving. And whatever he sees, he's like, it's not a plane. He's like, that's some kind of spaceship or something, or what he can imagine a spaceship to be. So he sprints back inside and he's yelling to everybody. He goes, there's a flying saucer that just landed in the backyard. And everybody starts laughing at him. And they're like, you're a joke. Like, what are you talking about? So he gets embarrassed and he kind of shuts up because they were just making him feel stupid until they start seeing something about a half hour later, because the dog gets up and heads to the porch and starts barking, and they turn and they see a glowing light in the distance. So the Suttons, they go outside to check this out, and they're looking at the distance, and whatever the dog is barking at is this like glowing orangey, like red light, kind of this hue coming from over the hill. But even scarier, in the dark, there is something that is walking towards the house. Something's out there, and something is wrong. The Suttons look back in the distance in the dark, and they see this thing. To their description, they were like, it looked like like a man, but not. It's about 3 to 4 feet tall, completely round head, just like the Flatwoods monster, claw hands, just like the monster, but its eyes have like a yellow tint to them, and it does not look human. But what is clear is that the creature is metallic, is what they said. It's partially metallic, just like the Flatwoods monster.
Right.
So the Suttons run in and they're like, absolutely not. Let's get the shotguns. And they just start going out and shooting at the thing. And I think they either hit it or they hit close to it because it scatters back into the darkness. But just minutes later, another one appears in the window of their house. And so to their description, they start firing again and they hit this thing through the window and they go out to check, like go outside. And that is when they are ambushed by these things all around them on the grounds of their property. They are coming from everywhere. Like they're in the trees, they're in the bushes, in the ground, on their roof. They are bombarded by these creatures and they start like reaching towards them with these claws. So the Suttons start firing all like in all directions. They're going up, they're going to the sides. And the thing that they know is that these things are fast. They jump from like tree to tree, surface to surface, and they don't have legs, just like the Flatwoods monster. It's like verbatim the same kind of thing. And they're just firing every which way they can, and they're hitting some of them, but it's like the more they hit, the more kind of show up. And this goes on for 4 hours. It took boxes of ammo of them outside firing and panicking. At a certain point, they get themselves away from these things. They're able to escape, and they drive to a police station. Once they get to the station, they're not mincing words. They're like, there's an alien invasion. There are creatures on our property. And there's a whole horde of officers and journalists who come flocking to the home. It's 25 people in total. Once they're there, there is nothing that could explain this story, except for all of like the bullet casings on the ground. So with no evidence, they're kind of just accused of like being drunk and like that they like told the tale, and the officers are like, you should sleep it off. And the whole station was like riled up about it. They're pissed that they all came out there. So the Suttons are basically laughed off and told to stop making things up. They are totally dismayed because if they're not going to stick around to help them, the Suttons have to sit there and defend themselves. After police leave, half hour passes. Someone in the family, a woman, sees a glowing yellow light near one of the windows upstairs. So she gets close to the window to properly see like what it is she's looking at. And that's when she can make out the face of one of the creatures that's pressed right up against that window. And its claws are on the screen looking into the house. So she shrieks. Everyone in the house comes running, and one of the men in the family shoots at the window. But then whatever was at the window jumps away and jumps to another window. And then there's another one that shows up at another window, and it's the same thing again. The family stayed up. They were up till 5:30 in the morning, just shattering every window in their house and bullets all through the wall.
I don't mean to laugh, but I was thinking to myself, damn, I hope one of them knows how to put glass back into a pane. Like,
I mean, it kind of made the story feel credible for me because I was like, nobody's just like shooting their house to hell if they don't think there's something out there. So to the family's description, as the sun was coming up, that's when all the creatures fled the grounds, almost like they can't bear the light. And by the time police come back in the morning, because police were like, we'll come back in the AM to check on you, there's still no evidence of these things except for the bullets everywhere and that they shot up their entire house. So word gets out to the neighborhood about this. Like the Suttons did all this, and they become the laughingstock of the town so bad because the press like ridicules them too because journalists had showed up. It's so terrible. They have to move. They have to relocate within 10 days.
What?
It's so embarrassing. But I'll tell you something that's messed up because they have a festival as well that happens in August. Decades
Does everybody shoot out their windows?
Well, the town, after they laughed all these people out, the town was like, this town in Kentucky, they're like, we're not doing so hot. Like, we need money to come into this town. And they remembered, like, somebody brought it up. They were like, wasn't there like a monster story or something that came out of here? And they're like, that's it. There's an alien encounter that took place here. Never mind the family that we ridiculed until they literally had to leave the town. We're going to capitalize on the story and make it a feature tourist attraction of the town. So they take the story, they like reimagine it, and it becomes a huge like historical mystery of the town of like, and they hold the Little Green Men Festival, which is a yearly attraction there on August 21st, which is the anniversary of the night this all happened to this family, and they were up till 5:30 a.m.
Oh my gosh. That poor family.
I know, but it gets even worse because a lot of people in the town, when they were like, they didn't see aliens, people were like, well, what did they see? Owls. They said it was owls.
Good night.
Okay, if you saw an owl, you would do that. You would.
I would do. I was going to say, now I understand. Now I side with them.
Because they were like, well, owls can be pretty big and their heads are like completely round and they have claws. They're like, so maybe they just saw the owls. And I'm like, nobody is staying up till 5:30 a.m. and not realizing after hour 6 that they're like, oh, you know what? I think that was an owl, actually. Like, no one's doing that. But I do think that this is an interesting story because this came 2 or 3 years after the Flatwoods monster, and it's about 300 to 400 miles away. And it's very similar, like down to the crash and kind of down to what they saw. But the Sutton family, who knows where they are in Kentucky now?
Oh, that poor family.
I know. But I feel like that kind of gives us another, like, an air of credibility a little bit. But that was the only additional event outside of the Flatwoods monster I wanted to tell you about. Because that's everything I've got, Stu.
Oh my gosh. Do people think that they're, like, do people talk about those two stories, like, kind of like bookends a little bit?
They do. I think it's usually grouped in because there are a few other stories that kind of coincide with the Flatwoods monster, like similar sightings that aren't too far from Flatwoods. But I think this is the one that's the most linked, if you know what I mean. Like,
yeah,
it seems like they run in tandem a bit. Also, it happening right at 7 p.m. I think is interesting. Like I
said. Well, and they're close by, right? The towns, not too far from each other.
Well, they're about 300 or 400 miles away, different states. So Flatwoods is West Virginia, and then wherever this was Kentucky.
But I didn't know if it was close to the border or something.
It's pretty, I mean, it's close enough, I would say, like in the grand scheme.
You know what? It's close enough. It's close enough to DC for something to.
It absolutely is. I mean, you had a sonic boom not too long ago.
I did. Did I?
At your place?
Oh, wait, did I tell you I heard it? I did.
Yeah. You told me that.
That was so wild. I mean,
I did look up videos of that after so I could hear it on like Ring cameras. That was crazy.
It was so weird. And everybody here was just, it was so odd because we had the same exact experience, but kind of similar to this. Suspend your disbelief. We all were like, huh. And we just kept continuing on with our lives until it broke in the news.
I mean, the thing is, I really don't have the energy for an alien invasion. I maybe did a few years ago, but
I don't either.
I'm just too tired for an alien invasion. Like, if War of the Worlds starts happening, I'm out early.
I'm out early.
I don't want to play the game. I don't want to play the game.
I don't
I always
either.
see those apocalypse movies, and I'm like, what are you guys all like fighting to survive for? Like, what's left of this world that you're like waiting to stick around in?
It's like life is gonna probably suck after this.
Yeah, it's probably not going to be a good time for you. Like, I'm too accustomed to like, I want my Trader Joe's stop. I want to.
I was going to say, how are you going to get your matcha?
I don't want to live in a world without pistachio milk. Is what I'm saying.
That's actually our little Green Men festival. We're just running around with little matchas.
Well, okay, so would you go with me to that thing for sure?
1,000%. Here's the thing.
Okay.
I love any small town lore. Like I love that regardless.
Eat it up.
But
I eat it up.
I just, so I'd be there. And I love, this was such a treat. Thank you so much. Like, I love extraterrestrial alien stuff. I think it's so interesting. Space.
We really haven't done one like this.
Me out.
We should do a really deep dive episode, a heavy deep dive episode on like the mysteries of space. We'll do that. We'll save that for another episode. But
I would
real quick
that.
Before I let you go, I have to ask you for the Creepers once and for all. How do you feel about this story? Do you think it was the work of fiction, or do you think there's some truth here? This answer will define your life for all of your days.
I'm literally if I say the wrong thing tonight, I'm gonna have like 1,000 owls descend upon my apartment. I'm just gonna have to shoot out all the windows because
Wait, you don't actually believe the owl theory, do you?
There's owls that live in this tree, and I see them, and it freaks me out, and I forget what they are.
No,
100%.
Okay, so you have a very specific personal experience.
Yeah.
You see them, and you're like, "Oh my god, is that an owl or is that something else?" Can they really look so?
You can
ambiguous in the dark.
You can see their little eyes, yeah, and you're like, "Wait, what is that?" But I
Did you hear the flapping?
The fact that you just said that,
and you wouldn't hear the flapping.
Imagine it, and I'm literally imagining the flapping is sending shivers down my spine. Creepers, I want you to know the very first thing I saw this morning.
I'm pulling it up right now. I'm pulling it up now.
Was a video. If you're a new listener, I have a really intense fear of birds. The very first thing I see at 6 8:45 a.m. this morning is a video from Silas that says, "Oh my God, this is going to send you," or something. And it was a crow in a window, just like coming inside, like talking to the
Did you listen to it with audio? I was going to say, I was like,
speaking.
She's like, well, the woman who's like, she's like talking to it in Spanish. She goes, hola, hola. And all of a sudden it goes, hola. Hold on, give me a second. I'm going to play it.
Hola. 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 Hola, cariño.
She goes, hola.
Oh, hola. So the fact that you did that was strike 2 for you. And then you mentioned flapping.
Okay. I'm out.
But to answer your question, I do think I believe that there's life outside of Earth for sure, or some sort of other type of creature of some sort. So I fully believe that this could have been. But I also think, I think that it's probably a U.S. government cover up in some capacity.
Interesting. I mean, I'm willing to, if it is a U.S. government thing, a test, or even like a terrorist, if it's like an outside government thing, I'm kind of enamored by like the description of the tech. But if I can get on board with that, I would side with you. But for me, I'm all in. I'm all in. It takes nothing for me. I could see a shooting star, and I could see a shooting star, Stu, and I'm like, they're coming.
Someday, maybe.
And with that, creepers, we are going to say farewell. Thank you so much for listening to a Friday episode of Creep Time. We loved having you around. This was so fun to do a alien episode. We haven't done one, actually. This really is like our first deep dive into it.
So fun.
Yeah. So if you want to hear another episode like this, or if you have a case suggestion, please let us know in the reviews or on YouTube. Make sure to follow or subscribe and hit that bell notification. I swear to God. And we're going to catch you next week on an episode. Should we say goodbye, Stu?
Bye, creepers.
Bye, everybody. See you later.